The iron shackles bit deeper into her ankles than the humiliation bit into her pride, but Amelia Sterling refused to scream as they chained her to the supply wagon in the center of Redstone's main street. Sheriff Nathaniel Cray had given her one final chance to accept his proposal, and when she spat in the dust at his boots instead of saying yes, he decided the entire town would witness what happened to women who dared refuse a man with a badge. What neither of them knew was that across the hills, a Modoc war chief named Kintpuash was watching through a spyglass, and he had very different ideas about chains, sheriffs, and the price of a woman's freedom. The morning sun cast long shadows across Redstone, California, a settlement that had sprouted like a weed in the aftermath of gold fever and government land grants. It was October 1872, and the air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter mixed with the ever-present smell of horse manure, wood smoke, and the particular desperation that clung to frontier towns like dust on everything else. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Amelia Sterling had been awake since before dawn, not by choice, but because the sound of boots on wooden planks outside her boarding house room had pulled her from dreams of green meadows and her grandmother's garden back in Ohio. She knew those boots belonged to Sheriff Nathaniel Cray, and she knew why he was pacing outside her door like a predator circling wounded prey. For 3 months, Sheriff Cray had been making his intentions known in ways that started polite and grew increasingly threatening. First came the flowers left on her schoolhouse desk, where she taught the settlement's children. Then came the visits during her evening walks, his horse conveniently appearing wherever she happened to be. Finally came the explicit proposal delivered in front of half the town at the general store: marry him or find herself without employment, without housing, and without any means of survival in a place where a woman's options were severely limited. Amelia had asked for time to consider, which everyone understood meant she was trying to find a polite way to refuse. But Sheriff Cray wasn't interested in polite refusals. He was interested in ownership, in the kind of control that came with a badge, a gun, and the knowledge that most people in Redstone owed their livelihoods to his family's influence. The Cray family had arrived in California during the gold rush, but unlike most prospectors, they'd gotten rich by selling supplies to miners rather than digging holes in the ground. Nathaniel's father, Judge Horace Cray, now owned the largest general store, the only bank, and through a series of strategic loans and foreclosures, a significant portion of the land around Redstone. When Nathaniel pinned on a sheriff's badge, it wasn't because the town needed law enforcement. It was because the Cray family needed legal authority to match their economic control. At 28, Nathaniel Cray was considered handsome by the standards of a settlement where most men looked like they'd been carved from tree bark and disappointment. He had dark hair that he kept slicked back with expensive pomade, a mustache that he groomed with the same attention other men gave to their horses, and clothes that were always clean despite the perpetual dust that covered everything else in Redstone. But Amelia had spent enough time around him to see past the surface polish to the entitled cruelty that lurked underneath. Amelia Sterling was 24 years old, with auburn hair that she kept pinned up in a practical bun, and green eyes that held more intelligence than most men in Redstone were comfortable seeing in a woman. She'd come west after her parents died of cholera in Ohio, carrying nothing but a teaching certificate, a small inheritance, and a stubborn determination to build a life on her own terms. The inheritance had lasted exactly 3 months before the harsh realities of frontier economics set in, but Amelia had managed to secure the position teaching Redstone's children, which paid enough to keep her fed and housed in Mrs. Hutchinson's boarding house. The teaching position came with its own complications. The schoolhouse was a single room, built from rough-hewn timber and optimism, where children ranging from 6 to 16 crowded onto wooden benches that had been carved by their fathers from local pine. Some days she had 8 students. Other days she had 23, depending on whether their families needed them for farm work or could spare them for learning. Amelia loved the work despite its challenges, but she'd quickly discovered that being an unmarried woman in a position of authority made certain men in Redstone uncomfortable in ways that manifested as both condescension and unwanted attention. Sheriff. Gray's pursuit had begun subtly enough. A polite nod when their paths crossed on Main Street, a comment about how nice it was to have an educated woman in town, an offer to escort her home from evening church services for her safety. Amelia had initially attributed his attention to frontier chivalry, but as the weeks passed, his behavior became increasingly possessive and demanding. The first real warning sign came when Amelia mentioned to Mrs. Hutchinson that she was considering taking a teaching position in Sacramento, where the pay was better and the living conditions more civilized. Within hours, Sheriff Cray appeared at the boarding house, ostensibly to discuss security concerns, but actually to interrogate Amelia about her travel plans. When she confirmed that she was indeed thinking of leaving Redstone, his demeanor shifted from polite interest to barely controlled anger. "Miss Sterling," he'd said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from wearing a badge, "I think you'll find that Redstone has everything a woman like you could need. It would be unfortunate if you made hasty decisions based on romantic notions about city life." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sheriff Cray wasn't asking her to stay. He was telling her that leaving might not be an option. Amelia had felt her stomach clench with the familiar fear that had followed her across the country, the fear of being trapped, of having her choices made by men who saw her as property rather than a person. That fear had crystallized into determination. 2 weeks ago, when Sheriff Cray made his proposal public, Amelia had been purchasing supplies at Cray's general store when Nathaniel emerged from the back office, where he'd been conducting business with his father. The store was crowded with the usual assortment of farmers, miners, and townspeople, conducting their weekly shopping, which made it the perfect audience for what Nathaniel clearly intended as a public declaration. "Miss Sterling," he'd announced, his voice carrying across the store, "I've been meaning to speak with you about a matter of mutual interest." Amelia had known immediately what was coming, but she'd hoped, naively as it turned out, that he would have the decency to propose privately. Instead, Sheriff Cray launched into a speech about the benefits of marriage, the security he could provide, and the natural order of a woman finding her place beside a successful man. The entire store had fallen silent, every person present, understanding that they were witnessing something that would shape the social dynamics of Redstone for years to come. When Nathaniel finally posed the actual question, "Miss Sterling, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Amelia had felt the weight of every gaze in the store. She understood the calculation she was supposed to make, accept his proposal and secure her position in Redstone's social hierarchy, or refuse and face the consequences of defying the most powerful family in town. Instead of calculating, Amelia had spoken from her heart. "Sheriff Cray," she'd said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "I appreciate your offer, but I must decline. I have no intention of marrying anyone at this time." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Nathaniel's face had flushed red with humiliation and rage, and Amelia had realized that she'd just made the most dangerous enemy possible in a place where she had no protection and nowhere to run. "Perhaps," Nathaniel had said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "you need time to reconsider what's truly in your best interests." That had been 2 weeks ago. Since then, Amelia's life in Redstone had become increasingly difficult in ways both subtle and overt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Parents began withdrawing their children from her classes, citing various excuses that all amounted to the same thing. Association with a woman who'd publicly humiliated the sheriff was becoming socially dangerous. Mrs. Hutchinson had mentioned, with obvious discomfort, that her other boarders were concerned about Amelia's continued residence. The weekly supply deliveries to the schoolhouse had been mysteriously delayed or forgotten entirely. Most ominously, Sheriff Cray had begun appearing wherever Amelia went, not to threaten or harass her directly, but simply to be present, a constant reminder of his power and her vulnerability. When she walked to the schoolhouse in the morning, his horse would be tied outside the general store, positioned so he could watch her pass. When she visited the church for evening services, he would arrive just as the service ended, offering to escort her home with a smile that never reached his eyes. The message was clear. He was watching, waiting, and tightening the noose of social and economic pressure until she had no choice but to accept his proposal or leave Redstone entirely. And leaving was becoming increasingly impossible as her employment options disappeared and her savings dwindled. This morning, as she listened to his boots pace outside her door, Amelia knew that Sheriff Cray's patience had finally expired. The sound stopped, and she heard the deliberate knock that she'd been dreading for weeks. "Miss Sterling," his voice carried through the thin wooden door. "I need to speak with you. Please open the door." Amelia sat on the edge of her narrow bed, still in her nightgown, staring at the door as if she could will it to become a barrier strong enough to keep out what was coming. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing different responses, different strategies for maintaining her dignity while navigating an impossible situation. But now that the moment had arrived, all her preparations felt inadequate. "Miss Sterling," Nathaniel's voice came again, more insistent this time. "I know. You're in there! Open the door, or I'll have Mrs. Hutchinson use her key." The threat was real. Mrs. Hutchinson would absolutely use her key if the sheriff demanded it, and then Amelia would be confronted while in her nightclothes, adding humiliation to whatever ultimatum Nathaniel intended to deliver. Amelia stood, wrapping her robe around herself and checking that it was securely tied. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. Sheriff Cray stood in the narrow hallway, his hat in his hands and his badge catching the early morning light filtering through the boarding house's single window. Behind him, Mrs. Hutchinson hovered nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to challenge a man who represented both legal authority and economic power. "Sheriff Cray," Amelia said, keeping her voice level, "this is hardly an appropriate time or place for a social call." "Miss Sterling," Nathaniel replied, his tone formal, but his eyes burning with barely contained emotion. "I'm afraid this isn't a social call. I'm here on official business." Amelia felt her heart sink. Official business meant he was using his badge to justify whatever he intended to do, which meant she had even fewer options than she'd thought. "What kind of official business?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "There have been reports of suspicious behavior from your residents, unexplained visitors, unusual activities that concern the safety and security of Redstone citizens." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Amelia had received no visitors except for the occasional parent discussing their child's education, and her activities consisted of teaching, reading, and walking to church. But Sheriff Cray's position gave his lies the weight of truth, at least in any official capacity. "I'm not aware of any suspicious behavior," Amelia said carefully. "Nevertheless, I need to conduct a search of your room, for the safety of the community." Mrs. Hutchinson made a small noise of protest, but when Nathaniel turned his gaze on her, she immediately fell silent. Amelia understood that refusing the search would only give him additional grounds for whatever action he'd already decided to take. "Very well," she said, stepping aside to allow him into her room. Nathaniel entered slowly, his eyes scanning the small space with exaggerated thoroughness. The room contained a bed, a washstand, a small desk where Amelia prepared her lessons, and a trunk that held her belongings. There was nothing suspicious to find, because there was nothing suspicious present, but Amelia watched with growing dread as Nathaniel moved toward her desk. He opened her lesson books, rifled through her personal correspondence, and examined her few possessions with the invasive thoroughness of someone looking for justification rather than evidence. Finally, he picked up a leather-bound journal where Amelia recorded her thoughts and observations about life in Redstone. "What's this?" he asked, though he was already opening it. "My personal journal. Sheriff Cray, surely even official business." "Doesn't extend to Miss Sterling," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice sharp with authority. "I'll determine what official business extends to." He read silently for several minutes, while Amelia stood frozen in horror. The journal contained her honest thoughts about Redstone, about the people she'd met, and most dangerously, about Sheriff Cray himself. She'd written about his persistent pursuit, her growing fear, and her conviction that he represented everything she'd come west to escape. When Nathaniel finally looked up from the journal, his expression was cold with rage. "Miss Sterling," he said slowly, "this journal contains numerous statements that could be interpreted as defamatory toward respected citizens of Redstone. It also includes observations about local customs and personalities that suggest a fundamental disrespect for this community." Amelia's mouth went dry. "Those are private thoughts, Sheriff Cray. Writing in a personal journal isn't a crime." "No," Nathaniel agreed, "but refusing to marry a respectable man, then writing scandalous accusations about him, suggests a character unsuitable for teaching children. It also suggests someone who might be unstable." The word unstable hung in the air like a threat. Amelia understood immediately what he was implying. In 1872, accusations of mental instability could result in a woman being committed to an asylum, legally stripped of all rights and autonomy. It was the ultimate weapon against women who refused to conform, and Sheriff Cray was wielding it with practiced precision. "I am not unstable," Amelia said firmly. "That remains to be determined. In the meantime, I'm afraid I'll need to detain you for a psychological evaluation, for the safety of the children in your care." Mrs. Hutchinson gasped audibly. Amelia felt the walls of her small room closing in as she realized that all her worst fears were coming true simultaneously. Sheriff Cray wasn't just punishing her for refusing his proposal. He was systematically destroying every aspect of her life while maintaining the pretense of legal authority. "You can't do this," Amelia said, though even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't true. "Miss Sterling," Nathaniel replied, his voice now carrying the cold satisfaction of complete control, "I can do exactly this. Get dressed. You're coming with me." As Amelia stared at the man who held her fate in his hands, she realized that she had arrived at the moment every woman feared most. The moment when all her choices were stripped away, when resistance meant destruction, and when the only options were submission or complete ruin. But Amelia Sterling had not come west to submit to anyone, and she had not survived the death of her parents, the challenges of frontier life, and months of escalating harassment, to surrender her dignity to a man who saw her as property to be claimed. "No," she said quietly. Nathaniel blinked, apparently not having expected such a simple refusal. "Excuse me?" I said no. "I won't marry you. I won't submit to a psychological evaluation, and I won't be detained based on fabricated charges and the contents of my private journal. For a moment, Nathaniel looked genuinely shocked that a woman would dare to refuse him so directly. Then his expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. "Miss Sterling," he said slowly, "you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be." "Good," Amelia replied, surprising herself with her own courage. "It should be difficult. Destroying someone's life should never be easy." That's when Sheriff Nathaniel Cray revealed exactly what kind of man he truly was. Instead of arresting Amelia privately, instead of taking her quietly to jail for a psychological evaluation, he decided that her public refusal required public punishment. "Get dressed," he ordered. "You're coming with me to the town square. If you won't marry me, and you won't submit to proper authority, then the people of Redstone need to see what happens to women who think they're above the natural order." As Amelia was forced to dress under Mrs. Hutchinson's terrified supervision, she had no idea that her public humiliation was about to become something far more dangerous than she could imagine. And she certainly had no idea that her defiance was being watched by someone who understood the price of refusing to submit to unjust authority. High in the hills overlooking Redstone, a Modoc war chief named Kintpuash lowered his spyglass and turned to his companion, a young warrior named Shonshin. "The white sheriff chains a woman for refusing him," Kintpuash said quietly. "It is not our concern," Shonshin replied. "She is white. Let whites deal with white problems." Kintpuash was quiet for a long moment, watching the drama unfold in the settlement below. He had seen too many instances of the strong destroying the weak, too many examples of authority being used as a weapon against those who could not defend themselves. The color of the woman's skin mattered less to him than the principle at stake. No one should be chained for refusing to surrender their freedom. "Perhaps," Kintpuash said finally, "it is time for whites to learn that some problems require different solutions." The chains around Amelia Sterling's ankles weighed 12 pounds each, but the weight of every stare from Redstone's gathered citizens felt heavier. Sheriff Nathaniel Cray had positioned the supply wagon in the exact center of Main Street, ensuring maximum visibility for what he called a lesson in proper behavior for unmarried women. The October sun beat down mercilessly as Amelia sat with her back against the wagon wheel, her hands bound behind her, watching the town she'd tried to call home transform into a theater of cruelty. It had been 3 hours since Sheriff Cray had dragged her from Mrs. Hutchinson's boarding house. 3 hours since he'd announced to anyone within earshot that Miss Amelia Sterling would remain chained to the wagon until she came to her senses about marriage and proper female submission. 3 hours of enduring the mixture of pity, disgust, and morbid curiosity that flickered across the faces of people she'd taught their children, shared meals with, and considered neighbors. But what disturbed Amelia most wasn't the physical discomfort, or even the public humiliation. It was the way the townspeople had so quickly accepted this spectacle as normal. Mrs. Henderson, whose daughter Sarah was one of Amelia's brightest students, had walked past without making eye contact. Tom Bradley, who'd always tipped his hat respectfully when they met, now crossed to the other side of the street rather than acknowledge her presence. Even Reverend Morrison, who preached about Christian charity every Sunday, had glanced at her situation and hurried into his church without a word. The message was clear. When authority decided to punish someone, even unjustly, the community would look away rather than risk becoming the next target. It was a lesson in frontier politics that Amelia had learned too late, but learned thoroughly. What Amelia didn't know was that her ordeal was being observed by someone who understood the dynamics of power and resistance from a very different perspective. High on the ridge overlooking Redstone, Kintpuash sat motionless in the shadow of a massive boulder, his eyes fixed on the drama unfolding below through a brass spyglass that had once belonged to a cavalry officer who no longer needed Kinpuash was 42 years old, though the harsh lines carved into his face by years of warfare and leadership made him appear older. His people called him Captain Jack, a name given by white soldiers who couldn't pronounce his true name, but among the Modoc he was simply Kinpuash, the one who strikes the water brashly. It was a name earned in childhood for his fearlessness in diving into dangerous rapids, and it had proven prophetic for a man who'd spent his adult life diving headfirst into the dangerous currents of resistance against American expansion. For 2 years, Kinpuash had led his band of Modoc warriors in a guerrilla war against the U.S. Army, fighting from the lava beds of Northern California with a tactical brilliance that had frustrated and embarrassed military commanders across the region. The Modoc War, as newspapers called it, had become a symbol of indigenous resistance, proof that even the might of the American military could be challenged by people who refused to surrender their homeland and their way of life. But the war was taking its toll. Kinpuash's band had dwindled from over 200 warriors to fewer than 50. Food was scarce, ammunition was running low, and the pressure from pursuing cavalry units was constant. Worse, some of his own people were beginning to question his leadership, arguing that continued resistance would only lead to complete destruction of their tribe. Kinpuash had come to the ridge above Redstone not for military purposes, but for solitude. He needed time to think, to consider whether the path of resistance he'd chosen was leading his people toward freedom or extinction. The white settlement below represented everything he was fighting against: the encroachment of American civilization, the displacement of native peoples, the transformation of ancestral lands into private property. He'd been watching Redstone for 3 days, studying its defenses and routines out of professional habit, when the drama of Amelia Sterling's public chaining had begun. Initially, he'd viewed it with detached interest, another example of white society's internal conflicts that didn't concern him. But as he'd watched the scene unfold through his spyglass, something about the woman's defiance had captured his attention. Through the magnified lens, Kinpuash could see details that the townspeople below might miss. He could see how Amelia held her head high despite her circumstances, how she met the stares of passers-by with direct eye contact rather than shame, how she'd refused the water that Sheriff Cray had mockingly offered in exchange for reconsidering his proposal. Most importantly, he could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire he recognized in warriors who would rather die fighting than live in submission. Beside him, his Lieutenant Shonchin shifted restlessly, uncomfortable with their extended observation of white affairs. "We should move on," Shonchin said quietly. "The cavalry patrol from Fort Klamath will reach the eastern pass by sunset. If we're not across the river by then, we'll be trapped in open country." Kinpuash nodded absently, but didn't lower the spyglass. He was watching Sheriff Cray pace around the chained woman, clearly enjoying his display of power. The sheriff would periodically stop in front of Amelia, lean down to speak words that Kinpuash couldn't hear but could easily interpret from the man's body language. Each time, Amelia would shake her head firmly, refusing whatever offer or demand he was making. "She fights," Kinpuash said quietly. "Who fights?" Shonchin asked, then followed Kinpuash's gaze toward the settlement. "The white woman? What does it matter if she fights? She is not our people." Kinpuash lowered the spyglass and turned to his companion. Shonchin was 28 years old, a brave warrior, but one who sometimes saw the world in terms too simple for the complexities they faced. To Shonchin there were Modoc and there were enemies, with little room for nuance between those categories. "Tell me, Shonchin," Kinpuash said slowly, "why do we fight the whites?" Shonchin looked puzzled by the question. "Because they take our land, because they kill our people, because they try to force us onto reservations where we will die slowly, instead of living free." "Yes," Kinpuash agreed. "We fight because they use their power to take away our choices, to force us to live as they decide we should live. But look," he gestured toward Redstone. "That woman refuses to let them take away her choices. She is chained for refusing to submit to their idea of how she should live. Are we so different?" Shonshin frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the comparison. "She is white. Her people are our enemies." "Her people, perhaps. But is she responsible for the actions of all whites, just as we would not want to be judged by the actions of all Indians?" Kinpuash raised the spyglass again, watching as Sheriff Craig grabbed Amelia's chin and forced her to look at him while he spoke. Even from this distance, Kinpuash could see her pull away with disgust. "That man uses his authority to destroy someone weaker than himself. How is that different from what the cavalry does to our villages?" Shonshin was quiet for a long moment, considering this perspective. Finally he said, "Even if that's true, what concern is it of ours? We have our own battles to fight." Kinpuash didn't answer immediately. He was remembering his wife, Toby, who had died 2 years ago during a cavalry raid on their winter camp. She had been preparing medicines for sick children when the soldiers arrived, but that hadn't stopped them from shooting her down like a dangerous animal. He remembered the way she had looked at him in those final moments. Not with fear, but with the same defiant fire he now saw in the white woman's eyes. "My grandfather once told me," Kinpuash said finally, "that a warrior's strength is measured not by how many enemies he can defeat, but by how many innocent people he can protect. He said that when we see injustice and do nothing, we become part of the injustice ourselves." "Your grandfather never had to fight cavalry units with repeating rifles," Shonshin pointed out. "He never had to choose between protecting one white woman and protecting our own people." Kinpuash knew his lieutenant was right. Every principle had to be weighed against practical survival. Their band was already stretched to its limits, already taking enormous risks just to remain free. Getting involved in white conflicts could expose them to unnecessary danger and provide no strategic benefit. But as he watched the scene below, Kinpuash found himself thinking about more than military strategy. He was thinking about the stories his grandmother had told him about the time before whites arrived, when the Modoc controlled the entire region around Tula Lake. In those stories, warriors were expected to protect anyone who sought their help, regardless of tribal affiliation. A warrior who refused aid to someone in need was considered no warrior at all. "There," Shonshin said suddenly, pointing toward the eastern horizon. "Dust cloud. The cavalry patrol." Kinpuash looked where his lieutenant was pointing and saw the telltale signs of mounted soldiers approaching in the distance. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the patrol reached a position where they could spot Kinpuash's small band on the ridge. "We need to move now," Shonshin urged. "The river crossing will be difficult enough without being pursued." Kinpuash took one last look through the spyglass at Amelia Sterling. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains, casting longer shadows across Main Street. Sheriff Cray had attracted a larger crowd of onlookers, apparently hoping that public pressure would eventually break the stubborn school teacher's resistance. But Amelia sat as straight as she had hours earlier, her jaw set with determination that hadn't wavered despite the physical discomfort and social humiliation. As Kinpuash watched, a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, broke away from his mother and ran toward Amelia with a tin cup of water. Before he could reach her, Sheriff Cray intercepted him, grabbing the cup and throwing its contents into the dust. "Nobody helps her until she comes to her senses," the sheriff announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She chose this situation. She can choose to end it any time." The boy began crying, and his mother hurried forward to collect him, shooting apologetic glances toward the sheriff. But Kinpuash had seen something else through his spyglass, the moment when Amelia looked at the crying child and mouthed the words, "Thank you," with such gentleness that it was clear she cared more about the boy's kindness than her own thirst. In that moment, Kinpuash made his decision. "Shanchin," he said, collapsing the spyglass and securing it in his belt. "Take the others to the river crossing. Wait for me there." "Wait for you? Where are you going?" Kinpuash was already moving down the ridge, using the natural cover of rocks and scrub brush to conceal his descent toward Redstone. "To remember what it means to be a warrior. Kinpuash, this is madness. You'll expose us all for one white woman who probably wouldn't help you if the situation were reversed." Kinpuash paused in his descent and turned back to his lieutenant. "Perhaps, but my grandmother taught me that we become what we practice. If we practice ignoring injustice, we become people who accept injustice. If we practice helping only our own people, we become people who see others as less than human." He gestured toward the settlement below. "The whites practice these things, and look what they have become." Shanchin shook his head in frustration. "You risk everything for principles that may get us all killed. Everything we are fighting for will be meaningless if we become like our enemies in the process of defeating them." With that, Kinpuash continued his careful descent toward Redstone, leaving Shanchin to make his own choice about whether to follow orders or conscience. As the war chief moved through the approaching dusk, he was acutely aware of the irony of his situation. For 2 years, he had fought to keep whites out of Modoc territory. Now he was voluntarily entering white territory to help one of them. But he had learned that true strength sometimes required accepting such ironies, just as true leadership sometimes required making decisions that others couldn't understand. Kinpuash had spent his entire adult life studying his enemies, learning their weaknesses and their fears. He knew that whites respected individual strength, but feared organized resistance. He knew they were more likely to negotiate with someone they saw as an equal than someone they saw as defeated. Most importantly, he knew that they often backed down when faced with unexpected courage, especially if that courage came from a direction they hadn't anticipated. As he reached the outskirts of Redstone, concealed in the shadows of the livery stable, Kinpuash could hear Sheriff Cray's voice carrying across the evening air. "Miss Sterling, this has gone on long enough. You've made your point, whatever it was supposed to be. Now it's time to be reasonable." Amelia's voice, hoarse from hours in the sun but still clear, responded, "Sheriff Cray, the only unreasonable thing I've done is underestimate how far you'd go to force a woman to marry you. I won't make that mistake again." "Marriage," Cray laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Who said anything about marriage? After this little display, I'm not sure you're suitable wife material anymore. But perhaps we can arrange something more temporary." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Kinpuash felt his hand move instinctively to the knife at his belt. He had heard enough to understand exactly what kind of man Sheriff Cray was, and exactly what would happen to Amelia Sterling if no one intervened. From his concealed position, Kinpuash studied the layout of Main Street, counting the number of people still gathered around the wagon, noting the positions of potential cover, calculating distances and angles. He had fought cavalry charges and artillery bombardments, but this situation required a different kind of strategy, one that would free the woman without starting a war that would endanger his people. As full darkness began to settle over Redstone, Kinpuash moved closer to the wagon where Amelia Sterling sat chained, her defiance unbroken, despite everything Sheriff Cray had put her through. Soon, she would learn that her refusal to submit had attracted the attention of someone who understood the true value of such courage. The war chief who had spent 2 years fighting for his people's freedom was about to discover that sometimes The most important battles were fought not for strategic advantage, but for the simple principle that no one should be chained for refusing to surrender their dignity. And Amelia Sterling, who had thought herself completely alone in her resistance, was about to learn that courage has a way of inspiring courage. Even across the deepest cultural divides, the first arrow came out of the darkness like whispered death, embedding itself in the wooden spoke of the wagon wheel exactly 6 inches from Sheriff Nathaniel Cray's head. The second arrow followed 3 heartbeats later, pinning his hat to the general store's front door with enough force to split the wood. By the time the third arrow thudded into the dirt at his feet, every person on Main Street understood that someone very skilled with a bow was sending a very clear message. Sheriff Cray dove behind a water trough, his hand fumbling for his revolver. As panic erupted around him, the small crowd that had gathered to witness Amelia Sterling's public humiliation scattered like startled chickens, some running for the saloon, others ducking into doorways, all of them suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. Within moments, Main Street was empty except for Amelia, still chained to the wagon, and Sheriff Cray, crouched behind inadequate cover and trying to locate an enemy he couldn't see. "Who's out there?" Cray shouted into the darkness, his voice cracking with fear and authority in equal measure. "Show yourself." The response came not in words, but in the soft whistle of another arrow that buried itself in the water trough inches from his shoulder, sending splinters of wood flying across his face. This arrow was different from the others. Instead of a steel point, it carried a small piece of bark wrapped around the shaft. Cray pulled it free with trembling hands and unrolled the bark to find a message carved in precise English letters. "Free her. Leave. Live." Amelia watched this impossible scene unfold with a mixture of terror and amazement. After 8 hours, chained to the wagon wheel, enduring Sheriff Cray's escalating threats and the townspeople's cruel indifference, she had resigned herself to facing whatever humiliation or violence he intended. The idea that someone would risk their life to help her, a stranger no less, was so far outside her experience that she wondered if exhaustion and thirst were causing hallucinations. But the arrows were real, and so was the fear in Sheriff Cray's eyes as he crouched behind the water trough, scanning the shadows for an enemy who remained invisible. Amelia had grown up on stories of Indian raids and frontier warfare, tales designed to terrify civilized folks about the savagery that lurked beyond the boundaries of white settlements. But there was nothing savage about the precision of those arrows, nothing random about their placement. Someone was sending a message with surgical accuracy, demonstrating that they could have killed Sheriff Cray easily, but were choosing restraint instead. "I know you're out there," Cray shouted again, his voice echoing off the empty buildings. "Come out and face me like a man." The answer came in the form of movement, not an arrow this time, but a shadow that seemed to detach itself from the darkness, between buildings and flow across Main Street like spilled ink. Amelia caught only a glimpse of the figure before it vanished again, but that glimpse was enough to confirm what she had already suspected. Their mysterious benefactor was Indian, moving with the kind of grace and stealth that came from a lifetime of hunting and warfare. Sheriff Cray must have seen the movement too, because he suddenly stood and fired 3 rapid shots from his revolver toward the alley where the shadow had disappeared. The gunshots were deafeningly loud in the quiet night, their echoes bouncing off buildings and rolling across the valley like thunder. But there was no cry of pain, no indication that any of the bullets had found their target. Instead, there was silence, the kind of deep, profound silence that made every nerve in Amelia's body stand on edge, the kind of silence that suggested a predator was circling just outside the range of vision. Sheriff Cray seemed to feel it too, because he kept turning in different directions, trying to watch all possible approaches simultaneously while reloading his weapon with hands that shook noticeably. "You want the woman?" Cray called out, desperation beginning to creep into his voice. "Fine, take her, but you'll have to come out to get her." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Sheriff Cray was using her as bait, trying to lure their unknown protector into the open, where he could be shot. The calculation was coldly logical. If the mysterious archer cared enough about her freedom to risk his life, he might be willing to expose himself to save her. But the shadow warrior, whoever he was, apparently understood the trap as well as Cray did. Instead of approaching the wagon directly, he began a different kind of psychological warfare. Sounds started coming from different directions. The soft scrape of boots on wood from the roof of the saloon, the almost inaudible whisper of movement from the alley beside the church, the faint creak of a board from the general store's back porch. Each sound came from a different location, creating the impression that multiple attackers were surrounding the sheriff from all sides. Sheriff Cray spun back and forth, trying to track the sounds, firing occasional shots at shadows that might or might not have been there. With each shot, his panic grew more obvious, his movements more erratic. Amelia realized she was watching a master tactician at work, someone who understood that fear was more effective than violence, that the threat of attack could be more paralyzing than an actual assault. "Stop playing games," Cray screamed into the darkness. "If you want to fight, then fight." The response, when it came, was not what anyone expected. Instead of another arrow or another ghost-like movement, a voice spoke from the darkness, calm, controlled, and speaking English with only the slightest accent. "I do not want to fight," the voice said, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "At once. I want you to free the woman and leave this place." Sheriff Cray whirled toward the sound, but the acoustics of the empty street made it impossible to pinpoint the speaker's location. "Who are you? What's your interest in this woman?" I'm someone who recognizes courage when I see it. She has shown more bravery chained to that wagon than you have shown with a badge and a gun." Amelia felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected validation. For hours, she had endured the stares and whispers of people who saw her situation as evidence of female foolishness. Proof that women who defied proper authority would inevitably face the consequences of their independence. To hear anyone, recognize her defiance as courage rather than stupidity was more healing than she had expected. "This is official sheriff's business," Cray shouted. "You're interfering with the law." A soft chuckle drifted from the darkness, containing more menace than any threat could have carried. "Your law, your sheriff, your idea of justice, but not mine." "You're Indian," Cray said, as if this revelation explained everything. "I should have known. You people can't mind your own business, can you? You chained a woman to a wagon for refusing to marry you. Perhaps you should consider whose business you are minding." The exchange revealed something that made Amelia's situation even more complicated. If her rescuer was indeed Indian, and his voice and tactics suggested he was, then Sheriff Cray could claim that this was an act of savage aggression against civilized authority. The story would spread that Indians were attacking innocent white women, confirming every prejudice and fear that frontier communities harbored about their native neighbors. But the mysterious voice seemed to understand this political dimension as well. "I offer you a choice, Sheriff. Free the woman and walk away, and this remains a private matter between us. Refuse, and tomorrow every newspaper in California will carry the story of how a white lawman had to be rescued from a single Indian by the cavalry he will undoubtedly summon." It was a masterful psychological stroke. Sheriff Cray's authority depended on his reputation for strength and competence. The idea of being humiliated by a lone Indian, then having to call for military assistance, would destroy his standing in the community and quite possibly end his political career. "You're bluffing," Cray said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You wouldn't risk open warfare over one white woman." "Perhaps not warfare, but I might risk making you look like a coward who hides behind badges and chains when faced with a real opponent." Sheriff Cray's face flushed red with rage and humiliation. He had built his identity around being the most powerful man in Redstone, the person who controlled every important decision and dominated every confrontation. Now he was crouched behind a water trough, being lectured about courage by an enemy. He couldn't even see while the woman he intended to possess watched his authority crumble in real time. "I'll kill you for this," Cray snarled. "I'll track you down," and his threat was cut short by the appearance of a figure stepping into the pool of light, cast by the lantern hanging outside the general store. Amelia got her first clear look at the man who had been tormenting Sheriff Cray from the shadows, and what she saw defied every expectation she had formed. Kinpuash stood perhaps 6 feet tall, with the lean, muscular build of someone who had spent his life hunting, fighting, and surviving in harsh country. His black hair was braided with small pieces of bone and metal that caught the lantern light, and his face bore the kind of weathered dignity that came from years of leadership, under impossible circumstances. But what struck Amelia most forcefully was his eyes, dark, intelligent, and completely unafraid, despite the fact that he was now exposed to Sheriff Cray's gun. He wore buckskin pants and a blue wool shirt that had probably been taken from a cavalry officer, along with a gun belt that held both a revolver and a knife with an elaborately carved bone handle. In his hands he carried a bow made from what looked like mountain sheep horn, strung with sinew and polished to a gleaming finish. Everything about his appearance spoke of someone who moved easily between the white and Indian worlds, while belonging completely to neither. "There," Kinpuash said calmly, raising his hands to show that the bow was unstrung. "Now you can see me. Does that make you feel stronger?" Sheriff Cray raised his revolver, pointing it directly at Kinpuash's chest. "It makes me feel like I can solve this problem permanently, perhaps. But can you solve it before I put this arrow through your heart?" Almost casually, Kinpuash had knocked an arrow and drawn the bow with movements so fluid they seemed effortless. The steel point was aimed directly at the center of Cray's chest, held steady despite the fact that the bow was fully drawn. They stood frozen in that tableau for what felt like an eternity, Sheriff Cray with his revolver trained on Kinpuash, Kinpuash with his arrow aimed at Cray's heart, and Amelia chained between them. Like the stakes in a deadly game, neither man could afford to lose. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, filled with the tension of violence that could explode at any moment. Finally, Kinpuash spoke again, his voice still calm despite the mortal danger of his situation. "Sheriff, we could kill each other here, and the woman would still be chained to the wagon, or you could unlock those shackles and walk away with your life and what remains of your dignity, and let you take her. Let everyone in town know that a sheriff backed down from a single Indian. I am not taking her anywhere. I am offering her the choice that you tried to steal, the choice to decide her own fate." Sheriff Cray's hand trembled slightly as he held the revolver. He was clearly torn between his rage and his survival instinct, between his desire to maintain dominance and his recognition that he was facing someone far more dangerous than he had initially realized. "This isn't over," Cray said finally. "Even if I let her go, even if I walk away, this isn't over between us. Perhaps not, but it is over for tonight." Slowly, reluctantly, Sheriff Cray lowered his revolver. But instead of moving toward Amelia to unlock her chains, he backed away toward the sheriff's office, keeping his weapon ready and his eyes fixed on Kinpuash. "The keys, Sheriff," Kinpuash said quietly. "Get them yourself," Cray snarled. "There, in my office." It was a final act of petty defiance, forcing Kinpuash to turn his back or expose himself to additional danger in order to free Amelia. But the Modoc war chief seemed to have anticipated this response. Without taking his eyes off Sheriff Cray, he reached into his belt and produced a small metal tool that looked like it had been fashioned from a horseshoe nail. "I have fought cavalry officers who chained prisoners," Kinpuash said as he moved toward Amelia, still keeping the arrow nocked and ready. "Their locks were more sophisticated than yours." Amelia watched in amazement as Kinpuash knelt beside the wagon wheel and began working on the shackles around her ankles. His hands moved with practiced precision, manipulating the improvised lockpick while maintaining perfect awareness of Sheriff Cray's position. Within moments, she heard the satisfying click of the first lock opening. "Can you walk?" Kinpuash asked quietly as he moved to the second shackle. "I think so," Amelia replied, though her legs were numb from hours of sitting in the same position. "When I free your hands, do not try to stand immediately. Your legs will not support you." The second lock clicked open, and Amelia felt the weight of the chains fall away from her ankles. The relief was so intense that she nearly cried, but Kinpuash was already working on the ropes that bound her hands behind her back. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered, keeping her voice low enough that Sheriff Cray couldn't hear. Kinpuash paused in his work for just a moment, meeting her eyes with an expression that was both gentle and fierce. "Because courage should be rewarded, not punished. Because someone who refuses to surrender their freedom deserves to keep it." The ropes fell away from her wrists, and Amelia brought her hands forward for the first time in 8 hours. Her shoulders screamed with pain as she moved her arms, and her wrists were raw and bleeding where the ropes had chafed, but she was free. "Now," Kinpuash said, standing and once again drawing his bow to full draw, "you have a choice to make." Amelia looked up at him, confused. "What choice?" "You can stay in this town and hope that Sheriff Cray will honor his defeat, though I suspect he will not. You can try to reach another settlement, though traveling alone as a single woman will be dangerous. Or—" He paused, as if considering the wisdom of what he was about to offer. "You can come with me, at least until you are far enough away to be safe." The offer stunned Amelia. She was being invited to leave her entire world behind, to trust her life to a man she had just met, a man whose people were supposedly at war with her people. It was an impossible choice, but then again, so had been the choice between marrying Sheriff Cray and maintaining her independence. "If I go with you," she said slowly, "what happens then? I do not know, but I know what happens if you stay." Sheriff Cray, who had been listening to this exchange from his position near the sheriff's office, suddenly raised his voice. "You're talking about kidnapping a white woman? That's an act of war." Kinpuash turned his attention back to the sheriff, his arrow still aimed at the man's chest. "I'm talking about offering sanctuary to someone who needs it. She is free to accept or refuse." "Miss Sterling," Cray called out, desperation clear in his voice, "don't trust him. He's a savage, a killer. If you go with him, you'll never be." Seen again. Amelia looked back and forth between the two men. Sheriff Cray, who represented the civilization and safety she had known all her life, and Kinpuash, who represented the unknown, but who had risked his life to free her from chains. The choice should have been obvious, but after everything she had experienced, the definition of civilization had become more complicated. "I need time to think," she said finally. Kinpuash nodded. "Time is something we do not have much of, but take what you need." As if to emphasize his point, the distant sound of horses could be heard approaching from the east, multiple riders moving fast through the night. Sheriff Cray's face broke into a triumphant grin. "That'll be the cavalry patrol from Fort Klamath," he said. "I sent word hours ago. You're trapped, Indian. Surrender now and maybe they'll let you live long enough for a trial." Kinpuash's expression didn't change, but Amelia could see him calculating distances, angles, and possibilities. The sound of approaching horses was getting louder, and soon they would be surrounded by trained soldiers with better weapons and superior numbers. "Miss Sterling," Kinpwash said quietly. "Your time for thinking has just run out." Amelia Sterling made her choice in the space between one heartbeat and the next, driven not by careful consideration, but by the sudden, crystal-clear understanding that staying in Redstone meant death, if not of her body, then certainly of everything that made her who she was. The sound of approaching cavalry hooves was growing louder by the second, and Sheriff Cray's triumphant expression told her exactly what kind of justice she could expect once the soldiers arrived. "I'll come with you," she said to Kinpwash, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to. The Modoc war chief nodded once, then moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had escaped impossible situations before. Without taking his eyes off Sheriff Cray, he whistled softly, a sound that could have been mistaken for a nightbird if anyone hadn't been listening carefully. From the shadows near the livery stable, another figure emerged, leading 2 horses, moving with the same ghost-like silence that had characterized the entire rescue. "Shonchin," Kinpwash said quietly as his lieutenant approached. "I thought I told you to wait at the river crossing." The younger warrior's face was grim with disapproval, but his loyalty was absolute. "I thought you might need a way out of this place," Shonchin replied in English, though his accent was much thicker than Kinpwash's. "The cavalry is perhaps 5 minutes away." Sheriff Cray raised his revolver again, sensing that his enemies were about to escape. "Nobody's going anywhere until those soldiers arrive. Miss Sterling, step away from those savages before you do something that can't be undone." Kinpwash moved so quickly that Amelia barely saw the motion. One moment he was standing several feet away from Sheriff Cray. The next he was directly in front of the lawman, his knife pressed against Cray's throat, while his other hand held the sheriff's gun wrist in an iron grip. "Sheriff," Kinpwash said conversationally, "you have caused enough trouble for one night. Go into your office and stay there until the cavalry arrives. Tell them whatever story you like, but remember, I know where you live, where you eat, where you sleep. If you send soldiers after us, I will consider that a personal invitation to visit you again." Sheriff Cray's face was pale with terror and rage, but he had no choice except to nod. Kinpwash released him with a slight push that sent the sheriff stumbling backward toward his office. "Come," Shonchin said urgently to Amelia, bringing one of the horses closer. "We must go now." Amelia had ridden horses before, but never bareback, and never in a dress that was completely unsuitable for mounting anything more challenging than a church pew. Shonchin seemed to understand her difficulty, because he cupped his hands to give her a boost up onto the horse's back. "Hold tight to the mane," he instructed. "This horse knows how to run in the dark." Kinpwash swung onto his own mount with practiced ease, and suddenly they were moving through the darkness at a pace that seemed suicidal to someone accustomed to civilized travel. The horses picked their way through the shadowy streets of Redstone as if they could see perfectly in the night, their hooves making almost no sound on the packed earth. Behind them, the sound of approaching cavalry was getting much closer. Amelia could hear individual voices now, shouting orders and coordinating their approach to the town. In minutes, perhaps seconds, they would arrive at Main Street to find Sheriff Cray's story of whatever he chose to tell them about the night's events. They reached the edge of town just as the first cavalry horses thundered into view behind them, their riders carrying torches that cast dancing shadows across the buildings. Amelia heard shouting, saw the flicker of flames, but then they were beyond the settlement's borders and moving into open country where the darkness swallowed them completely. For the first hour, they rode in silence through terrain that seemed impossibly treacherous in the moonlight. Kinpwash led them along what appeared to be a deer trail, winding through stands of pine and oak, following a route that was invisible to Amelia but clearly familiar to him. Behind them, the lights of pursuing cavalry gradually faded until they disappeared entirely, though the sound of distant horses continued for much longer. Amelia had never experienced anything like this midnight flight through unknown country. Every shadow could hide a cliff edge or a fallen tree. Every sound could signal an ambush or pursuit. Every moment required absolute trust in her companions and their ability to navigate safely through the darkness. Her entire body ached from the unfamiliar strain of riding bareback. Her hands were raw from gripping the horse's mane, and her torn dress was completely inadequate protection against the cold night air. But underneath the physical discomfort and the fear of pursuit, Amelia felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the exhilarating sensation of moving toward an unknown future instead of being trapped in an impossible present. For the first time since arriving in Redstone, she was making her own choices about her own life, even if those choices were being made in partnership with people she had been taught to fear. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 90 minutes, Kintpuash finally called a halt in a small clearing beside a creek that was invisible until they were almost on top of it. The horses were breathing hard from the sustained pace, and even Amelia could tell they needed rest. "We can stop here for a short time," Kintpuash said quietly, dismounting and immediately moving to check the trail behind them for signs of pursuit. "The cavalry will not follow us in the dark through this country. Too much risk of losing horses or men in terrain they do not know." Shunshin helped Amelia down from her horse, steadying her when her legs nearly buckled from exhaustion and the after-effects of being chained for 8 hours. "You did well," he said, and she could tell from his tone that the praise was genuine, rather than merely polite. "I don't think I've ever been so terrified in my life," Amelia admitted, sitting down heavily on a fallen log beside the creek. "Fear is useful," Kintpuash said, joining them after completing his reconnaissance. "It keeps you alive, but you did not let fear control you, which is why you are still free." For the first time since the rescue began, Amelia had an opportunity to really look at the two men who had risked their lives to help her. In the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, she could see that both were younger than she had initially thought. Kintpuash perhaps in his early 40s, Shunshin probably in his late 20s. Both carried themselves with the confidence of experienced warriors, but there was something about their bearing that suggested they were accustomed to leadership rather than simple violence. "I need to ask," Amelia said slowly, "why did you help me? I'm a stranger to you, a white woman whose people are—" She struggled to find a diplomatic way to phrase it. "At war with my people," Kintpuash finished. "Yes, they are. But you are not at war with me. You were chained for refusing to surrender your freedom, which is something I understand very well." Shunshin made a sound that might have been disagreement, and Kintpuash turned to him with a questioning look. "She should know what she has done," Shunshin said. "What we have all done tonight." "What do you mean?" Amelia asked, though she suspected. She didn't want to hear the answer. Kintpuash was quiet for a moment, apparently deciding how much to explain. Finally, he said, "Sheriff Cray will claim that you were kidnapped by hostile Indians. The cavalry will be ordered to pursue us and recover you by force. When they fail to find us quickly, the story will spread that white women are being taken by savage raiders." "But that's not what happened," Amelia protested. "What happened and what will be reported are often very different things," Shunshin said bitterly. "Your sheriff will use this to justify increased military action against all Indian people in the region. He will say we are dangerous, unpredictable, that we steal white women for purposes too terrible to mention in polite company." The implications hit Amelia like a physical blow. Her rescue had potentially made life more dangerous for every native person in California, providing ammunition for those who argued that Indians were inherently violent and needed to be controlled or eliminated entirely. "I'm sorry," she said, though the words felt completely inadequate. "I didn't think about the larger consequences." "Neither did I," Kintpuash admitted. "I saw injustice and acted to stop it. But Shunshin is right. Our actions tonight will have consequences beyond what any of us intended." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sound of the creek and the distant calls of night birds. Amelia found herself wondering what her life would have been like if she had simply accepted Sheriff Cray's proposal, married him, and settled into the role of a frontier wife. Certainly, it would have been safer, more predictable, more socially acceptable. But it also would have required her to become someone she wasn't, to accept that her dreams and desires mattered less than male authority and social expectations. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now we continue running," Kinpuash said. "The cavalry will search for us at first light, and they know this country well enough to track us if we leave too clear a trail. We need to reach the lava beds before they can organize a proper pursuit." "The lava beds? My people's stronghold," Shonshin explained. "Broken country formed by ancient volcanic activity. Easy to defend. Almost impossible for cavalry to operate in effectively. We have been fighting the army from there for 2 years." Amelia felt another chill of realization. "You're taking me to a place where you're actively fighting a war against my government. We are taking you to a place where you will be safe," Kinpuash corrected. "What happens after that depends on choices that have not been made yet." "What choices?" Kinpuash stood and began checking the horses' hooves and legs, making sure they were ready for the next stage of their journey. "You can stay with us until the immediate danger passes, then decide where you want to go and what kind of life you want to build. You can ask us to take you to another white settlement far from Sheriff Cray's influence. Or—" He paused as, "if unsure whether to continue, or what. Or you can stay with us permanently, learn our ways, become part of our community. It is not unknown for white people to choose to live among Indians, though it requires leaving your old life completely behind." The suggestion was so radical that Amelia could barely process it. The idea of permanently joining an Indian community, of abandoning white civilization entirely, was beyond anything she had ever considered. But then again, so had been the idea of being chained to a wagon for refusing marriage. "I don't know anything about your culture," she said. "I don't speak your language. I don't understand your customs. I wouldn't know how to be useful to your people." "You are a teacher," Shonshin pointed out. "That is always useful, and you have shown courage under pressure, which is even more valuable. But I'm white. Your people are at war with white people. How could they possibly trust me?" Kinpuash finished his inspection of the horses and turned back to her. "Trust is earned, not given. The color of your skin matters less than the content of your character. If you proved yourself worthy of trust, most of my people would judge you by your actions rather than your ancestry. Most of them. Some still believe that all whites are enemies who can never be trusted. The same way some whites believe that all Indians are savages who can never be civilized. Hatred makes people stupid on both sides of any conflict." Amelia stood and walked to the edge of the creek, kneeling to splash cold water on her face and her hands. The shock of the cold helped clear her thoughts, but it didn't make her situation any less impossible. Behind her lay a life that had become intolerable. Ahead lay an unknown future that might be even more dangerous. "I need you to understand something," she said, turning back to face the two men. "I'm grateful for what you've done, more grateful than I can express, but I also need to be honest about what I can and can't promise. I don't know if I'm brave enough to live permanently outside my own culture. I don't know if I can adapt to a completely different way of life. And I don't know what kind of burden my presence might place on your people." "Honesty is a good beginning," Kinpuash said approvingly. "Many people make promises they cannot keep when they are desperate. Better to admit uncertainty than to lie about your intentions." "But for now," Shonshin added, "such questions can wait. For now, we must focus on staying alive and staying free. Everything else can be decided later." Kinpuash nodded and began saddling the horses again. "He is right. We have perhaps 3 hours before dawn. and we need to cover much more ground before the cavalry can organize an effective search. Are you ready to continue?" Amelia looked at the horse she had been riding, dreading the prospect of more hours traveling bareback through rough country. Every muscle in her body ached. Her hands were raw and bleeding, and she was wearing a dress that had been designed for teaching school, not fleeing through the wilderness. But she was also more free than she had been in months, traveling with people who had risked their lives to help her escape from an impossible situation. Whatever lay ahead couldn't be worse than what she had left behind. "I'm ready," she said, accepting Shonshin's help to mount the horse again. As they resumed their flight through the darkness, following ancient trails through country that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of civilization, Amelia found herself thinking about the stories she had been told about frontier life. Those stories always featured brave pioneers bringing civilization to the wilderness, imposing order on chaos, replacing savagery with Christian values and democratic institutions. But tonight, it had been representatives of that civilization who had chained her to a wagon for refusing to surrender her autonomy. It had been the supposed savages who had risked their lives to defend the principle that no one should be forced to surrender their freedom against their will. Perhaps, Amelia thought as they rode deeper into the unknown, the stories she had been told were not as simple as she had been led to believe. Perhaps the line between civilization and savagery had more to do with how people treated each other than with the color of their skin or the culture they had been born into. Behind them, the lights of Redstone had long since disappeared. Ahead lay the lava beds and whatever future awaited them there, and around them the vast wilderness of California stretched endlessly in all directions, indifferent to human conflicts, but offering sanctuary to those brave enough to claim it. The war between the Modoc and the United States Army would continue, but tonight 3 people had chosen to fight a different kind of battle, one for the principle that courage deserved protection regardless of the political consequences. Whether that choice would lead to triumph or tragedy remained to be seen, but at least it had been made freely, without chains or coercion. As dawn approached, and they pushed deeper into country where few white people had ever traveled, Sterling began to understand that freedom was not a destination, but a choice that had to be made over and over again, each time with full knowledge of the risks involved. Tonight, she had made that choice. Tomorrow, she would have to make it again. The lava beds revealed themselves at dawn like the remains of some ancient war between earth and sky, a twisted landscape of black rock formations that jutted from the ground in impossible shapes. Amelia had never seen anything like it. Volcanic stone, carved by centuries of wind and weather into natural fortresses, with caves and tunnels that seemed to burrow endlessly into the earth itself. As they rode through this alien terrain, she began to understand why the Modoc had been able to hold off the United States Army for 2 years. This wasn't just difficult country for cavalry to operate in, it was a 3-dimensional maze where a handful of defenders could make life miserable for hundreds of attackers. "Welcome to our stronghold," Kinpuash said, as they approached what appeared to be a solid wall of black rock. But as they drew closer, Amelia could see that what looked like an impenetrable barrier was actually riddled with passages and openings. Some large enough for horses, others barely wide enough for a single person. "The army calls this place hell on earth. We call it home." Shonshin guided them through a narrow passage that twisted between towering stone walls, following a route that seemed random but was clearly known to him. They rode in single file, with Kinpuash leading and Shonshin bringing up the rear, while Amelia marveled at the natural architecture surrounding them. The passage opened occasionally into small clearings, where grass and stunted trees had found purchase in pockets of soil, but mostly they traveled through corridors of stone that echoed with the sound of their horses' hooves. After perhaps 20, Minutes of navigation through this labyrinth, they emerged into a larger clearing, where Amelia got her first look at the Modoc community that had been fighting the most powerful nation on Earth from this volcanic fortress. What she saw challenged every expectation she had formed about Indian life, based on the stories and illustrations she had encountered in newspapers and books. The camp was organized with military precision, with designated areas for different functions, weapon maintenance, food preparation, council meetings, and sleeping quarters that took advantage of natural caves and rock formations for shelter. Perhaps 40 people moved about their daily tasks with the efficient purpose of a community that had learned to make every resource count. But what struck Amelia most forcefully was how normal it all looked. These weren't the bloodthirsty savages of frontier mythology. They were families, warriors, elders, and children going about the business of survival with dignity and determination. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Children stopped their games to stare at the strange white woman, while adults emerged from caves and shelters to get a better look at what Kintpuash and Shonchin had brought back from their scouting mission. The attention wasn't hostile exactly, but it was intense and calculating, as if everyone was trying to determine whether Amelia represented an opportunity, a threat, or simply another problem to be managed. An elderly woman approached them as they dismounted, her weathered face carved with lines that spoke of decades of hardship and wisdom. She wore a dress that combined traditional Modoc beadwork with practical frontier clothing, and she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Kintpuash," she said, her voice carrying easily across the clearing. "Explain to me why you have brought a white woman to our stronghold during wartime." "Toby Riddle," Kintpuash replied with obvious respect. "This is Miss Amelia Sterling. She was chained to a wagon by a white sheriff for refusing to marry him. I offered her sanctuary." Toby Riddle's eyes moved to Amelia, studying her with the kind of penetrating gaze that seemed to see through surface appearances to something deeper underneath. Amelia had heard of Toby Riddle. She was famous throughout the region as an interpreter and mediator between white and Indian communities. Someone who moved easily between both worlds while maintaining the trust of neither side completely. "Miss Sterling," Toby said in perfect English, "do you understand what kind of place you have come to?" "I'm beginning to," Amelia replied honestly. "Mr. Kintpuash explained that this is where his people have been fighting the army. I know my presence here creates complications." Complications. Toby's smile was grim. "That is one way to describe it. Another way would be to say that your presence here could be used to justify the army bringing in artillery and reducing this entire place to rubble." A murmur went through the gathered crowd at this suggestion, and Amelia could see fear and anger flickering across various faces. She had known intellectually that her rescue would have consequences, but being confronted with the specific ways her presence endangered these people made those consequences feel much more real. "I didn't ask to be rescued," Amelia said, though even as she spoke, she realized how inadequate that sounded. "I'm grateful for what Mr. Kintpuash did, but if my being here puts your people in danger, then perhaps we should find another solution." "What other solution?" asked a voice from the crowd. A young warrior stepped forward, his face painted with red and black designs that emphasized the anger in his expression. "You are here now. The damage is done. The army will come looking for you, and they will use your presence as an excuse to attack us with everything they have." "Hooker Jim," Kintpuash said warningly, "this woman is under my protection." "Your protection?" Hooker Jim's voice rose with indignation. "What about your protection of our people? What about your responsibility to put Modoc lives ahead of white lives?" Other voices joined the argument, some supporting Hooker Jim's position, others defending Kintpuash's decision. The debate was conducted in a mixture of English and Modoc, but Amelia could follow enough of it to understand that her presence had touched on deeper divisions within the community about how to conduct their resistance against the United States. Toby. Riddle raised her hand for silence, and the arguing gradually subsided. "This argument serves no purpose," she said firmly. "The woman is here. The question is what we do about it." "We could send her back," suggested an older man whose grey hair was braided with eagle feathers. "Return her to the whites and let them know we took no hostile action against her." "They will never believe that," Shonchin said. "The sheriff will claim we kidnapped her. Even if she tells them the truth, they will say she was forced to lie. To protect us. Then we keep her here as insurance," Hooker Jim said. "If the army attacks, we use her as a bargaining chip." "No." Kinpuash's voice cut through the discussion like a knife. "I did not rescue her from one form of captivity to subject her to another. She will not be a prisoner here." "Then what do you propose?" Toby asked. Kinpuash looked around the circle of faces, then at Amelia herself. "I propose we let her speak for herself. She is the person most affected by these decisions. Let her tell us what she thinks should happen." All eyes turned to Amelia, and she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. These people were asking her to help decide not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of their entire community. It was a level of trust and respect that she had never experienced, even in her own culture. "I need to understand something first," Amelia said slowly. "If I stay here, what would that mean? What would be expected of me?" "That depends," Toby replied, "on what you can contribute. We are not a charity. Everyone here must earn their place through useful work. I'm a teacher. I can read and write in English, and I have some knowledge of mathematics and history. I can also sew, cook basic meals, and tend to sick people, though I'm not trained as a physician." "A teacher," mused the elder with the eagle feathers. "Our children need to learn English if they are to survive in the white world, but they also need to maintain their connection to Modoc culture and language." "I would be honored to teach English," Amelia said, "but only if someone would teach me about Modoc culture in return. I don't want to impose white ways of thinking on your children. I want to help them navigate both worlds successfully." This response seemed to surprise several people in the crowd. Hooker Jim frowned as if he suspected some kind of trick, while others nodded approvingly at her willingness to learn rather than simply impose her own cultural assumptions. "And if the army comes," asked another voice, "if they attack this place because you are here, what then?" Amelia took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would define how these people saw her for as long as she remained among them. "If the army attacks because of me, then I will stand with you and face whatever consequences come. I won't hide behind your protection while others die for my freedom." "You would fight against your own people?" Hooker Jim asked skeptically. "My own people chained me to a wagon," Amelia replied. "My own people were content to watch me suffer rather than challenge unjust authority. These are my people now, if they'll have me." The statement sent a ripple of surprise through the crowd. Declaring allegiance to the Modoc wasn't just a personal decision. It was a political act that could be interpreted as treason by the United States government. If Amelia was ever captured by the army, her declaration of loyalty to their enemies could result in her being tried and executed as a traitor. "Strong words," Toby said thoughtfully, "but words are easier than actions. How do we know you mean what you say?" "You don't," Amelia admitted. "Trust has to be earned over time. All I can do is promise to prove myself through my actions and hope that you'll give me the opportunity to do so." Kinpuash stepped forward, addressing the crowd rather than Amelia. "I have seen this woman's courage. She endured 8 hours chained to a wagon rather than surrender her freedom to a man who would have destroyed her spirit. When I offered her a choice between safety and uncertainty, she chose uncertainty rather than accept a life without dignity. These are not the actions of someone who lacks conviction. Pretty speeches, Hooker Jim said, but what happens when the first artillery shells start falling? What happens when she sees white soldiers dying because of choices she helped make? Will her convictions survive watching men who look like her father and brothers bleed in the dust? It was a brutal question, but not an unfair one. Amelia had never seen battle, never watched people die violently, never been forced to choose between conflicting loyalties under life and death pressure. Hooker Jim was asking whether her commitment would survive contact with the realities of warfare. I don't know, Amelia said honestly. I can't predict how I'll react to situations I've never faced. But I can tell you that I've already watched my own people reveal themselves to be capable of cruelty and injustice. I've already seen the difference between those who use power to help and those who use it to harm. If war comes, I'll stand with the people who freed me from chains, not with the people who put them on. An older woman who had been silent throughout the discussion suddenly spoke up. She has the look of someone who has suffered, she said in accented English. Suffering either makes people bitter or wise. This one does not look bitter. Wechala speaks truth, agreed another elder. The girl's eyes are clear. She is not hiding from us. The debate continued for another hour, with various community members expressing their opinions about the risks and benefits of allowing Amelia to remain in their stronghold. Some argued that any white presence was too dangerous during wartime. Others pointed out that having someone who could serve as an interpreter and cultural bridge might prove valuable. Still others suggested that her teaching skills could help prepare Modoc children for a future where they would need to navigate white society successfully. Finally, Toby Riddle called for a formal decision. "We will vote," she announced. "All adults may participate. Those who believe Amelia Sterling should be allowed to remain with us, step to the right. Those who believe she should be sent away, step to the left." Amelia watched with her heart pounding as the community members made their choice. Kinpuash and Shonshin immediately stepped to the right, followed by several elders and about half the younger warriors. Hooker Jim led a smaller group to the left, along with some others who clearly viewed her presence as too risky to tolerate. When the movement stopped, Toby counted the groups. 23 in favor of allowing her to stay, 14 opposed. The woman may remain, but she will be watched carefully. Any sign that she cannot be trusted, any indication that her presence brings more danger than benefit, and this decision will be reconsidered. Amelia felt a wave of relief, so intense that her knees nearly buckled. She had been accepted, provisionally at least, into a community that was risking everything by allowing her to stay. The responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the gratitude. "Thank you," she said, addressing the entire group. "I know this decision wasn't easy, and I know some of you have serious doubts about the wisdom of allowing me to stay. I hope I can prove worthy of the trust you're placing in me." "Hope is insufficient," Hooker Jim said bluntly as the crowd began to disperse. "You will prove yourself or you will be removed. Those are your only options." As the formal gathering broke up, Toby Riddle approached Amelia with a practical expression. "Come with me. You need proper clothing if you're going to survive here, and you need to understand how our community works. Tomorrow, you can begin earning your place among us. But today, you need to learn how to live like a Modoc." As Amelia followed Toby toward one of the larger caves that served as a communal workspace, she caught sight of Kinpuash, watching her with an expression that was difficult to read. He had risked a great deal to rescue her, and now he was watching to see whether his faith in her character would prove justified. Behind them, the lava bed stretched endlessly in all directions, a natural fortress that had protected the Modoc. for 2 years, but might not be able to protect them much longer. Somewhere beyond the volcanic landscape, cavalry patrols were already searching for the white woman who had supposedly been kidnapped by hostile Indians. Soon, those patrols would become a full military expedition, and the relative peace of the stronghold would be shattered by the violence of war. But for now, in this moment between one crisis and the next, Amelia Sterling was beginning the most challenging transformation of her life, learning to become someone who belonged neither to the white world she had left behind, nor fully to the Modoc world she was entering, but to something new that she would have to create for herself through courage, determination, and the kind of trust that could only be earned one day at a time. The lava beds had accepted her, but now she had to prove that she could accept them in return. 3 months later, Amelia Sterling no longer existed. In her place stood someone who moved through the lava beds with the confidence of belonging, someone whose hands bore the calluses of useful work and whose eyes reflected the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving in a world where every choice carried life and death consequences. The woman who had once taught school in a frontier town now instructed Modoc children in English while learning their language in return. Someone who could track game through volcanic terrain and prepare traditional medicines from plants that grew in the cracks of ancient stone. But on this particular morning, as she helped prepare breakfast for the community, Amelia could hear something that made her blood run cold. The distant sound of artillery fire echoing off the lava formations. The war that had been postponed by winter weather and military reorganization had finally arrived in earnest, and with it came the reckoning that everyone had known was inevitable. "How many?" Kinpuash asked Shonchin, who had just returned from a reconnaissance mission to the eastern approaches of their stronghold. "More than before. At least 400 soldiers, plus artillery pieces and supply wagons. They're not planning a quick raid this time. They're planning a siege." Amelia felt her stomach clench with familiar dread, but it was a different kind of fear than she had experienced in Redstone. Then she had been afraid for herself, for her own freedom and dignity. Now she was afraid for the children she taught, for the families who had accepted her as one of their own, for the community that had risked everything by offering her sanctuary. "It's because of me," she said quietly. "They're not just fighting you anymore. They're trying to rescue a white woman they believe you kidnapped." Kinpuash looked at her with an expression that was both gentle and firm. "They would have come anyway. The army was always going to try to force us onto the reservation. Your presence gives them a convenient excuse, but it is not the cause of this war." But Amelia knew better. She had seen the newspaper articles that Toby Riddle occasionally brought back from her trips to nearby settlements, articles that portrayed her rescue as a shocking example of Indian savagery. The stories described her as an innocent schoolteacher kidnapped by bloodthirsty warriors, held captive for unspeakable purposes. None of them mentioned that she had chosen to stay, that she had found more dignity and respect among the Modoc than she had ever experienced in white society. The artillery fire was getting closer, and Amelia could see the systematic way the army was approaching their stronghold. Instead of the direct assaults that had failed in previous campaigns, they were using their superior numbers and firepower to gradually constrict the area under Modoc control. It was a strategy designed to slowly strangle the resistance rather than crush it quickly. "The children need to be moved to the deep caves," Toby Riddle said, emerging from the underground passages where the community's most vulnerable members took shelter during attacks. "And we need to decide what to do about our white woman problem." All eyes turned to Amelia, and she understood immediately what Toby meant. As long as she remained with the Modoc, the army could justify increasingly violent tactics by claiming they were trying to rescue a kidnapped white woman. Her presence, which had once been a symbol of the community's willingness to transcend racial boundaries, had become a strategic liability that could get everyone killed. "I know what you're thinking," Amelia said, before anyone could speak. "You're thinking that if I surrender to the army, they might be willing to negotiate instead of simply trying to destroy you." "The thought had occurred to us," Toby admitted. "Your voluntary return might convince them that we are not the monsters they believe us to be." Amelia looked around at the faces of people who had become her family, people who had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. She thought about the children who called her Teacher Amelia and looked forward to their English lessons. She thought about the elderly women who had patiently taught her to work with traditional medicines and laughed at her early mistakes. She thought about Kintpuash, who had risked everything to free her from chains and had never once made her feel like a burden, despite the complications her presence had created. "No," she said finally, "I won't surrender to people who would chain a woman to a wagon for refusing marriage. I won't let them use me as an excuse for violence against people who have shown me nothing but kindness." "Amelia," Kintpuash said gently, "this is not your war to fight. You have already proven your courage and your loyalty. No one would think less of you for choosing to protect yourself." "This became my war the moment I chose to stay here," Amelia replied. "These people are my people now. I won't abandon them to save myself." Before anyone could respond, a young warrior came running into the clearing, his face grim with urgent news. "They're sending someone forward under a white flag. Looks like they want to talk." Kintpuash and several other leaders quickly made their way to an observation point that overlooked the army's positions. Through a borrowed spyglass, Amelia could see a small group of soldiers approaching the lava beds, one of them carrying a white flag of truce. "I recognize him," Toby said, taking the spyglass. "Colonel Alvin Gillum. He's the new military commander for this region, and the man with him." She paused, her expression darkening. "Sheriff Nathaniel Cray." Amelia felt. Her blood turned to ice. Sheriff Cray's presence meant that this wasn't just a military operation. It was a personal mission of revenge, disguised as a rescue. Whatever terms the army offered would be designed to humiliate the Modoc and allow Cray to reclaim what he saw as his stolen property. "I'll go talk to them," Kintpuash said. "No," Amelia said suddenly. "Let me go." Everyone stared at her as if she had suggested jumping off a cliff. "Absolutely not," Shonchin said. "It's obviously a trap." "Maybe, but it's also an opportunity." Amelia's mind was racing as she worked through the possibilities. They expect to find a traumatized victim who will be grateful for rescue. Instead, they'll find someone who chose to stay, someone who can tell them exactly what kind of man Sheriff Cray really is. "They won't believe you," Toby warned. "They'll say you were forced to speak against him, that you've been brainwashed or threatened." "Some of them will think that," Amelia agreed, "but not all of them. And once the truth starts to spread, it becomes much harder to suppress." She looked directly at Kintpuash. "You saved me from chains once. Now let me try to save you from a war that doesn't need to happen." The discussion that followed was intense and brief, conducted in a mixture of English and Modoc, as various community members expressed their opinions about the wisdom of allowing Amelia to face her former captors. Some argued that it was too dangerous, that Sheriff Cray would simply arrest her and fabricate whatever story served his purposes. Others pointed out that her voluntary appearance might indeed convince reasonable people that the situation was more complicated than the newspapers had portrayed. Finally, Kintpuash made the decision. "She goes, but not alone. I will accompany her." "That's even more dangerous," Amelia protested. "If they capture you, they will not capture me. But they will see that you are there by choice, that you are not afraid of the man who supposedly protects you." An hour later, Amelia walked out of the lava beds beside Kintpuash, approaching the white flag that marked the neutral ground where negotiations would take place. She wore traditional Modoc clothing that Toby had helped her make. her hair braided with small shells and beads that caught the morning sunlight. She looked like what she had become, someone who belonged to the volcanic stronghold, not someone who needed to be rescued from it. Sheriff Cray's face went through a series of expressions when he saw her: surprise, rage, and something that might have been fear, as he realized that his narrative of victimization was about to be challenged by the supposed victim herself. "Miss Sterling," Colonel Gillam said formally, "we're here to bring you home safely. You've been through a terrible ordeal, but it's over now." "Colonel," Amelia replied, her voice steady and clear, "I appreciate your concern, but I am home. I chose to stay with these people, and I choose to remain with them." The statement sent a visible shock through the small group of soldiers. This wasn't the grateful, traumatized victim they had been expecting. This was someone speaking with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. "Miss Sterling," Sheriff Cray said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "you don't know what you're saying. These savages have obviously—" "Sheriff Cray," Amelia interrupted, her voice carrying across the negotiation ground with absolute clarity, "these people freed me from the chains you put on me. They offered me respect and dignity that I never found in your so-called civilized society. The only savage behavior I've experienced came from a man with a badge who thought his authority gave him the right to own another human being." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Colonel Gillam looked back and forth between Amelia and Sheriff Cray, clearly trying to reconcile what he was hearing with the story he had been told. "Colonel," Amelia continued, "I am here voluntarily. I am not being held against my will. These people are not the monsters your newspapers have portrayed them to be. They are families fighting to protect their homeland and their way of life from people who want to destroy both. You don't understand the larger issues at stake, Colonel," Gillam said, though his voice lacked the certainty it had carried before. "There are questions of law, of territorial authority. There are questions of justice," Kintwash said, speaking for the first time. "Your law says that might makes right, that whoever has the most soldiers can take whatever they want. Our law says that people should be free to live as they choose, as long as they harm no one else." The negotiation continued for 2 hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The army had come to rescue a white woman who didn't want to be rescued, to punish Indians for a kidnapping that had never occurred. When Amelia walked back into the lava beds beside Kintwash, she carried with her the knowledge that she had chosen her path freely and completely. The war would continue. There was too much pride and political pressure on both sides for it to end with a simple conversation. But something important had been accomplished. The truth had been spoken publicly, witnessed by soldiers who would carry that truth back to their camps and their letters home. 6 months later, when the Modoc War finally ended and the surviving members of Kintwash's band were forced onto reservations, Amelia Sterling made one final choice. She could have returned to white society, could have reclaimed her old life, and tried to forget everything that had happened. Instead, she followed her adopted people to the reservation, where she spent the rest of her life teaching children who belonged to two worlds and helping them navigate the challenges of living in both. She never married Sheriff Nathaniel Cray. She never again allowed anyone to put chains on her, literal or metaphorical, and she never regretted the choice she had made that night when a Modoc war chief offered her freedom instead of safety. Sometimes the most important battles are not fought for territory or resources, but for the simple principle that every person has the right to choose their own destiny. Amelia Sterling had fought that battle and won, not through violence or domination, but through the kind of courage that changes hearts and minds, one conversation at a time. In a world where power often masqueraded as justice, she had learned to recognize the difference. In a society that confused authority with righteousness, she had found people who understood that true strength came from protecting the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. And in the end, that made all the difference. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.